Hello everyone. Today we're going to talk about Immanuel Kant. Immanuel Kant is an 18th century German philosopher. He is considered a major thinker of the Enlightenment movement, if not a major thinker at all, because he profoundly influenced Western philosophy. After him, our way of thinking was transformed. We know Kant best for his moral philosophy, which we've already covered on this channel. His moral philosophy is based on the notion of duty and respect for the moral law. But it is his philosophy of knowledge that has truly marked the history of ideas. Today we're going to try and understand why everyone agrees that Kant is an extremely difficult writer. He uses a highly technical vocabulary and sometimes redefines philosophical concepts. He is so difficult to understand that Nietzsche nicknamed him the Great Chinaman, in reference to the expression to speak Chinese to mean something incomprehensible. But don't worry, we're going to rephrase what Kant is telling us and simplify his words to make them more accessible. So, what's he talking about? Kant is talking about knowledge, and more specifically about the limits of our knowledge. The question he poses is, what can we know, and why does he ask it? He asks it because he feels that, up until his time, philosophers have spent their time discussing things that are impossible to know, or talking about things without asking whether we can really know them. Three things come up frequently in these discussions: God, the soul, and the world. Philosophers have been talking about these subjects since Aristotle and even Plato. In fact, this was the very essence of philosophers' work, to talk about invisible things, to talk about suprasensible things, to talk about suprasensible things, things that escape perception. This is what we call metaphysics, the study of what lies beyond the physical, the material, and observation. For if philosophers were content to study the material world, they would be called physicists. What Kant is telling us is that, in wanting to talk about things that escape perception, in wanting to talk about things that escape our senses, philosophers have forgotten to ask themselves a prior question. Is it even possible to know these things? This question is the subject of Kant's great work, The Critique of Pure Reason, a work that aims to define the conditions of possibility of knowledge, the structural limits of knowledge, what Kant calls the a priori limits of knowledge. And what are these limits? Let's start with the first limit, namely that we cannot know things we cannot perceive. For there to be knowledge, there must first be perception. We'll come back to this later because in reality, it's not quite as simple as that. But let's remember that, for Kant, perception is the foundation of knowledge. In fact, this is the very first sentence of his introduction. I quote, "All knowledge begins with experience. There is absolutely no doubt about it." So this sentence is very important because it means that when we talk about things that lie outside the field of experience, outside the field of perception, we're not talking about knowledge, but about thought. Yes, but not in knowledge. And when Kant tells us that there's a difference between thinking a thing and knowing it, there are things we can think, but we can't know. For example, we can think that life continues after death, we can believe it, but fundamentally we can't know it, we can't prove it. The immortality of the soul is an object of thought, but not an object of knowledge. That's where it all comes in the difference between what we can think and what we can know. And what Kant is telling us is that the philosophers up to him, what he calls the metaphysicians, have taken as objects of knowledge what are, in fact, only objects of thought. And this, according to Kant, is the fundamental error of metaphysics. Philosophers speculate, reasoning out of the ground, reasoning that is sometimes highly complex and subtle, but remains purely speculative, reasoning that floats in the air, not based on observable reality. And for centuries, we've taken it for granted to talk about things that escape our senses. But when Kant says non-stop, we stop with that. It's enough to talk about things we don't know. It's enough to pretend we're talking about things we do know because we're not. We speculate, we conjecture, we imagine, but we don't know. This is Kant's gesture to set the metaphysical record straight and put an end to the illusions of reason, to the belief that reason is all-powerful and can dispense with experience to arrive at the truth. Indeed, when Kant uses an image, it is to say that reason must be brought before a tribunal, the tribunal of reason, in order to judge what it is capable of, and what it is not. The critique of pure reason is the philosophical trial of human reason. Initially, Kant is a Cartesian, in the sense that he subscribes to Descartes' positions on the powers of reason. Descartes tells us that knowledge can be attained by reason alone, by thought alone, without recourse to experience. But for Descartes, experience, perception, is precisely what misleads us. At first, Kant agreed with this. Then, for his part, Kant explains that a thought that is not based on experience, we think, is not based on perception. It's an empty thought, and suddenly, for Kant, it's crystal clear. Of course, we can't think without experience. Of course, thinking must be based on a material that is perception. When Kant says that Hume awakened him from his dogmatic slumber, that he awakened him from his rationalist conception of knowledge, i.e., a conception of knowledge based solely on reason and not on experience, then this seems obvious to us today. But it seems obvious to us because, from the point of view of the history of ideas, Hume has won. For today empiricism dominates, and we can't imagine a science that isn't based on observation. But until the 18th century, it wasn't so obvious. Until the 18th century, many philosophers, like Descartes, believed that experience was deceptive, that the senses were misleading. This is the whole point of the metaphysical meditations, which show that we must go beyond sensible impression. Kant was the first to say, okay, the empiricists are right. They're right in the sense that it's all very well to want to use one's reason. But using one's reason on nothing but itself is not enough. We need supports for rational knowledge. And these supports for rational knowledge are sensible objects, objects of which we can have a sensible intuition. It's important to remember that for Kant, sensible intuition is the other name for sensible experience. The word intuition does not have the same meaning for Kant as it does for other philosophers, or even in everyday language. You perceive the objects around you. You perceive their shape, their size, their color. You perceive their shape, their size, their color. You have a sensitive intuition of them. But what Kant tells us is that the only things we can know are those of which we can have a sensible intuition, observable things. This, then, is the first step in Kant's reflection on the question of knowledge. The second stage of his reasoning is to ask, but is what I perceive, what I can sensitively intuit, really reality? Is it reality? Or is it the way reality appears to me? In reality, it appears to my senses. The answer is obviously in the question. To say, does the world as I perceive it correspond to the real world, or only to the world as I perceive it, is a tautology, but it's a fundamental tautology. And it's something that had not yet been explored by philosophers in Kant's time, the idea that there is no identity, no equivalence between the real world and the world as I perceive it. And as I perceive, it doesn't just mean as I perceive it, but as it is perceived, as human beings perceive it. Because it's silly to say it, but our perception of the world doesn't necessarily correspond to the reality of the world. Let's take a simple example. Colors. Are the things we perceive as blue really blue? Are they intrinsically blue, or is it our eyes that make us perceive them as blue? This is not a stupid question at all, because we now know that there are many things we perceive in a certain way, not because they really are, but because our perception is tuned in a certain way. We don't see infrared light, yet it exists. We don't see ultraviolet light, yet it exists. Some animals perceive colors differently. Why are they different? Because the organs of perception differ from one species to another. Humans, for example, perceive 3 ranges of colors, red, green, and blue, because we have 3 types of cones, each corresponding to a range of colors. So what we see when we have a sensitive intuition of an object is that object filtered by our cones, our sensory organs. It filters the world. So when we talk about the world, we're actually talking about the world as we perceive it through a filter. We're not talking about the world, but about what seems to us to be the world. We're not talking about the world, but about the filter that stands between us and the world. This is the difference between what Kant calls phenomenal reality and reality and reality and reality in itself. This is reality as we perceive it, the phenomena. It is what appears to us, what manifests itself. Reality in itself is reality independent of our perception. Yes, but that's very nice, reality independent of our perception. But reality is always dependent on our perception. Reality independent of our perception is a reality to which, by definition, we have no access. So how can we know something to which we have no access? Therein lies the problem, and it's not just a thinking game. It's not just a question of playing with words and saying that reality isn't real and that we're geniuses because we've understood it. That's not what it's about. It's simply a question of saying that we can't say anything about the world apart from what we perceive of it. It's a structural limit, an a priori limit. There's an illustration of this idea that I like to use. It's the example of the apple. A green apple. What color is a green apple? You're going to tell me it's green apple. You're going to tell me it's green. Yes, it's green, but is it really? Well, no, strictly speaking. An apple that looks green to us isn't green at all. It reflects green. It sends back green because it's made up of chemical components that react to light, and when an apple appears green to us, it means that it absorbs red and blue and sends back green. This is known as subtractive color synthesis. So the color of an object is not the color of that object, it's the color reflected by that object. This changes everything. An object is said to have this or that color when it reflects that color. In other words, the green apple is an apple that is anything but green. It's strange when you think about it. And this color will be captured by my retina, which will send a message to my brain, which will process the information to make me perceive the color. Perception is therefore the result of the brain's processing of retinal data, which in turn depends on the sensitivity of the retinal data, which in turn depends on the sensitivity of the retina. When I perceive a color, I'm not perceiving a color, I'm perceiving the effect of a retinal phenomenon. When I perceive an object, what I really perceive is the functioning of my eye. I don't perceive the object, I perceive the object, I perceive my perception. What Kant is telling us is that all knowledge is fundamentally limited by the conditions of our perception. All knowledge is conditioned by the structures of perception. Hence the idea that reality itself, what Kant calls the noumenon, is forever inaccessible to us. We are prisoners of our senses, just as we are prisoners of the words with which we think. We can only be aware that what we perceive is not reality, but only our perception of reality, When Kant isn't talking about colors, he's talking about something else. He's talking about space and time, and he's telling us that space and time are the a priori forms of sensibility. What does this mean? It means that nothing can be perceived, and therefore nothing can be perceived, and therefore nothing can be known outside space and time. Space is the domain of external objects, physical objects. This smartphone, this pen, this microphone, they occupy space. They take their place in a space. No object could exist. Time is the domain of inner objects, of psychic states. A psychic state is characterized by its duration. Without the dimension of time, there is no inner feeling. What Kant is telling us is that we have the perceptions of our cognitive equipment. It's because our sensibility is structured by the two parameters of space and time that we perceive objects sometimes in terms of space, sometimes in terms of space, sometimes in terms of time. And why is this important? Because it means that it's not so much the world that is spatial and temporal in nature, but our perception of the world that is spatial and temporal. In other words, space and time are not properties of the world, but properties of our perception. When you call this aesthetic, take its mental meaning. In Greek, aesthetikos means sensation or perception, as in the word anesthesia. Anesthesia is the absence of sensation. Transcendental is a word meaning that which makes possible. Be careful not to confuse transcendental with transcendent. We often use the word transcendental to mean transcendent, which is not at all the same thing. One could even say that the two words are opposites. Transcendent means that which comes from above, that which is above the subject and descends towards the subject to transcend it. Transcendental, on the other hand, is what starts from the subject, the foundation, the internal structure. Transcendental aesthetics is the analysis of the structures of our perceptions of our perception. This is why Kant's philosophy is called transcendental idealism. Idealism because, according to Kant, we do not know the world, but only a representation of it. Idealism is a question of representation. Transcendental because this representation has conditions. It has a structure, in this case space and time. So, to simplify, we could say that transcendental idealism is the doctrine which consists in saying, on the one hand, that we don't have access to reality, but only to a representation of reality, and on the other hand, that this representation of reality is structured by two parameters which are space and time. Now, let's take a breather, because I know this isn't easy. Let's explain why Kant's philosophical project is so original. Kant is a Christian philosopher, a Protestant, and therefore a believer, like Descartes and many others at the time. And yet, Kant says that we can't prove the existence of God, that we can't prove him. It's quite astonishing to see a believing philosopher himself assert that we can't prove the existence of God. It's like shooting yourself in the foot, you might say. Well, it's not. In fact, it's an honest and coherent approach because Kant is aware of the difference between the realms of reason and faith. He recognizes that there is a gulf between the two. Pascal pointed this out before him, saying that to try to demonstrate the existence of God is to try to prove the undemonstrable, which makes no sense. God escapes the tools of rationality, so it's a futile enterprise. If we choose to believe in God, we might as well bet on his existence. Betting on God's existence is ultimately more honest and coherent than trying to prove it. Descartes, for his part, sought to demonstrate the existence of God. He tried to prove that God exists through the instrument of reason. One of his arguments is that if God is a perfect being, he can't not exist, otherwise he wouldn't be perfect because he'd be missing something. This is known as the ontological argument, the argument that deduces the existence of a thing from its definition. However, Kant disagrees with Descartes. He would tell Descartes that his demonstration doesn't work, or that it isn't a demonstration at all. Descartes hasn't demonstrated anything, he simply repeated the same thing twice. If we define something, like God, as perfect, then to say that it exists because it is perfect is simply to repeat that it is perfect. It's like saying that all left-handed tennis players are left-handed. It doesn't demonstrate anything, it just repeats what was already contained in the first statement. Kant points out that it's too easy. You could claim to prove the existence of anything with this method. If I say that something that is obliged to exist exists, I have introduced my conclusion into my premise. That's cheating. Descartes' example illustrates the fact that reason sometimes pushes us to say anything, or more precisely, that reason can lead us to contradictory conclusions, to antinomies. This is what Kant calls the antinomies of pure reason. Just as Descartes believed he had demonstrated the existence of God through reason, we can reach contradictory conclusions using reason alone. Some will say they have demonstrated the non-existence of God through reason. For example, they claim that everything that exists has a cause. So, if God exists, he must have a cause. But if God has a cause, he's no longer God, so God doesn't exist. The problem with reason is that it can demonstrate everything and its opposite. It can demonstrate that God exists, just as it can demonstrate that God doesn't exist. Similarly, it can demonstrate that we are free, just as it can demonstrate that we are determined. The problem with reason is that we can't trust it completely because it has its limits. This is where Kant's analysis comes in. It calls reason into question, bringing it down from its pedestal. Reason is no longer the supreme judge of truth. This means that not only does our perception have limits, it doesn't give us access to reality as such, but reason itself has limits. Knowledge, the product of perception and reason, is therefore doubly limited by the limits of our perception and by the limits of our reason. Just as there is a structure to perception, known as the a priori forms of sensibility, so there is a structure to reason known as the a priori forms of understanding. Before delving further into this notion, it is important to emphasize that Kant's project is a critical one. He seeks not only to explain how to know, but also to explain what it is impossible to know. This is why Kant is sometimes referred to as a conscious critic. Philosophy is a critical approach to knowledge, which is of crucial importance. It gave rise to epistemology, a branch of the philosophy of science that studies the conditions of possibility of knowledge. When we change our way of thinking and consider the human mind in all its limitations and failings, our aim is no longer to define the world but to understand the thinking subject, how it functions and why it deludes itself into thinking it can know the world. Let's return now to the a priori forms of understanding, also known as categories of understanding. There are 4 of them: quantity, quality, relation, and modality. In other words, all the objects our understanding is capable of conceiving can only be apprehended through these categories. No category or concept of reason can escape these categories. There is nothing thinkable outside these categories, just as it is impossible to imagine a new color. This principle also applies to understanding. Although comparison is not an argument in itself, let me draw a parallel to illustrate this idea. It's like when Spinoza explains that everything man is capable of conceiving can be understood either under the attribute of extent, or under the attribute of thought. Does this mean that the world consists of nothing but extent and thought? No, it means that the world is knowable only through these attributes. Similarly, human reason is structured by categories of thought, a container for thought. Nothing can be thought outside this container. This is why we said earlier that knowledge tells us not only about the world but also about our faculties of knowledge themselves. To know is first and foremost to understand how the mind works. When we talk about mathematical knowledge, which is supposed to be the most reliable and objective knowledge there is, he tells us that mathematical knowledge is a pure product of the mind, what he calls a priori knowledge. This means that such knowledge is totally independent of experience. A priori knowledge, like logical mathematical knowledge, only tells us how the mind is structured. Mathematics is called objective. But this is not because it is objective in itself, but because it simply reflects the way our reason works. To produce mathematical knowledge is to produce knowledge of our mind. Ultimately, what Kant is doing is demonstrating the relativity of our knowledge. Human knowledge is always partial, conditioned, and constrained by its structure. To say this at the time was a major philosophical leap because it meant ceasing to consider reason as a tool for reaching the absolute, which is reason's natural tendency. To want to reach the first cause, the last end, the ultimate meaning, the natural inclination of reason, is to regress infinitely to the truth. But Kant tells us that these are illusions, because the structure of the world is not the same as that of reason, because the structure of the world is not the same as that of reason. Until the 18th century, there was a kind of implicit, tacit belief that the structure of reason corresponded to that of the world, but this is not the case. The illusion lies in the fact that it's not knowledge that regulates itself on the world, it's the world that regulates itself on knowledge, on the possibilities of knowledge. Ancient philosophy was less about knowing the world than about knowing knowledge itself. It was here that Kant initiated what would come to be known as the Copernican revolution in philosophy. It is no longer the world that is at the center, with the subject seeking to know it, but the subject seeking to know it, but the subject who becomes central, and it is the world that adapts to him. The world conforms to the subject's modalities of perception and understanding, and because it conforms to them, it denatures itself. It is no longer reality in itself. It becomes phenomenal reality, the reality we can perceive and understand. The world that revolves around the subject is the world as perceived and thought by the subject, not the absolute world. When Kant absolutizes knowledge, he reduces it to its conditions of human production. He introduces the subjectivity of the thinking subject as an essential component of knowledge of the thought object. He reverses the hierarchy, transforming the subject into a hierarchy, the thinking reason and the thought world. Reason becomes the object of thought, not the world. With Kant, thought looks in the mirror for the first time. As he himself puts it, the point here is to make a change of method analogous to that accomplished by mathematics in Greek antiquity, when, instead of the trial and error to which it had indulged until then, a few great minds succeeded in bringing knowledge of the object out of the object out of the object out of the a priori construction of its concept, or to that achieved by the modern physical sciences, when, instead of letting themselves be led by nature as if on a tightrope, they undertook to direct and interpret experiments according to the very principles of reason, and thus forced nature to respond as a sovereign judge. The authors of these revolutions understood that reason perceives only what it produces of itself, according to its own plans. It is this conception that we are trying to introduce into metaphysics in order to bring about a revolution similar to that which has produced such happy effects in mathematics and physics. We compare the idea of this revolution to that of Copernicus. Copernicus, seeing that he could not explain the movements of the sky by admitting that the whole multitude of stars revolves around the spectator, sought to see whether it would not be better to suppose that it is the spectator who revolves and that the stars remain motionless. In the same way, instead of assuming, as we have until now, that all our knowledge is regulated by objects, we assume that it is, on the contrary, objects that are regulated by our knowledge. In this way, we believe we can solve the problem that is the first question, and a question of life and death for metaphysics. How is a priori knowledge of things possible? The answer can be summed up in this thought. If we consider the touchstone of the new method, it is that we know, a priori, only what we ourselves put into things. This leads to a consequence apparently contrary to the purpose of metaphysics. We cannot, with this faculty, go beyond the limits of possible experience. For the a priori contribution we make to our knowledge of nature contributes precisely to making it possible, and outside this use, it can have no meaning. As a counterproof of the truth of this result, our philosophy points to a type of experimentation that bears many similarities to what chemists often call reduction tests. It consists in testing the a priori principles of reason by considering them successively from two different points of view. On the one hand, as we make things known as they are in themselves, and on the other, as we make them known only as they appear to us by virtue of the a priori laws of our mind, or in a word, as phenomena. If, in the first case, reason is in real conflict with itself, this contradiction disappears in the second. It will be shown that our reason only reaches phenomena without being able to extend to things in themselves which, although real in themselves, remain unknown to us. Since the 18th century, man has become aware of his limits. He realized that the world was not as he imagined it, and that before knowing the world, we had to begin by knowing ourselves. Kant was the initiator of this project, the self-criticism of human reason, a reason that now recognizes its fallibility, its partiality, its relativity, and invites us not to entrust everything to it, not to make it assume everything. The main illusion of reason is that we generally call our own conception of reason, and label as irrational everything that does not correspond to this conception. Knowledge is something we hold dear, and reason is our only means of attaining it. Let's hope that all beings endowed with it recognize that another reason is possible. Thank you for your attention.